My name is Matthew Johnson. I'm going to be reading a story called Holdfast. It was published in Fantasy Magazine in December of 2010 and included in the year's Best Science Fiction and Fantasy 2011 edition. Errol was halfway through milking Blackeye when the sky went dark with dragons. He looked up to see what had happened and saw dozens of winged shapes obscuring the sun in the east. They were flying low to the ground. That might mean rain, but if they were riding dragons, it meant battle coming. He shrugged and turned back to his work, resuming his interrupted song. 5 riders in a ring, round Bessie's udder. Bessie bring milk, milk bring butter. Milk fell into the bucket with each pull, thick and yellow with cream drawn from the charm. Errol's daughter Neve sat on a stool across the yard, churning the milk. With every 4th stroke she clapped the churn staff down hard to catch the hands of any witches or devils that might try to spoil the butter. She stopped partway through a stroke and pointed over Errol's head. He turned just in time to see the load of worm cast falling a short distance away to the west. Errol gave one more pull of Blackeye's udder and patted her on the side. "Good girl," he said as he stood. Then he called out, "Sifrid, get the wagon and shovels." Sifrid, the seasoned man, was over by the house. He waved and then headed for the carriage house. Grunting a little with the effort, he lifted the harness off of the wooden hook and went to the stalls. Sviput and Svegjut whickered as he passed, impatient to be let out into the yard. He called Sviput, the gelding, with a whistle and then led him to where the leather collars hung. Once the horse was dressed, Errol brought him outside, shading his eyes against the change in light. Sifrid had loaded the dray with shovels and drawn it up by the gate. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His childhood in the city had not well prepared him for farm work, and he stooped with exhaustion as he drew the cart into position to be harnessed. "Where are we going?" he asked, as he dumb-tied the tug to the horse's collar. Errol pointed down the road to the west, then gave the gelding a pat and tossed the halter over its neck. He leaned down to loosen the holdfast on the gate, then lifted it carefully and hung it on the fence post before leading the horse and dray forward with a tug of the harness rope. He kept a tight hand on it. The ram's knot would give Sviput strength to pull the load when the cart was full, but for now it only made him headstrong. Sifrid closed the gate and followed along a few steps behind. The road was rough, holed by hoof prints and stranger spoors. After they had been walking for a while, they saw a man ahead leading a donkey-drawn cart. Errol gave the lead a tug, letting Sviput go more quickly, and they soon drew up close enough to see that it was Allrun, who worked the farm on the other side of Slow Creek. "Morning find you," Allrun said, touching the brim of his hat and tugging it. Errol touched his hat in response. "And you," he said. He gave the lead a pull to slow the horse, found himself breathing harder than he was used to. His years had mostly spared his strength, but he had lost much of his wind. "You saw it too, I suppose?" Errol nodded. "And there's been men this way, looks like." Allrun pointed to a break in the fencing at the side of the road. Beyond it, the wheat had been trampled and torn from the ground, the heads broken and kernels scattered. Or almost men. Only the Margrave's beasts would eat plain rye, and before harvest time, too. "People will eat the same as pigs if they're hungry enough." "That's true as you say it," Allrun said, nodding. The wind, which had been blowing from the south all morning, had shifted to the west. It brought the smell of worm cast, acrid and sulphurous. It grew stronger as they kept walking, passing beyond the fenced land and into marshy country. Finally, they began to see the first drops of worm cast, pats of manure about a hand around that were fibrous like a horse's droppings, but dark, oily, and resinous. Errol had Sifrid gather them as they passed. Each drop clung to the seasoned man's gloves, needing a hard shake to fall into the cart. The largest concentration lay ahead, in a pile about a cowhide around that had fallen on a stretch of peatland at the edge of the marsh. 2 more men with carts were standing at the side of the road, having come from the opposite direction. One Errol knew as Carton, a brinker whose tiny strip of land stood just outside the marsh, and the other one he did not know at all. Both touched their hats at his and Allrun's arrival. "Fair morning," Carton said. "To you," Errol said. Allrun looked back the way they had come, then further down the road. Do either of you claim a stake by law in this find? He asked. After a moment, the two men shook their heads. Then I propose we divide equal stakes. Do you all agree? Carton and the other man looked to Errol. After a moment, he nodded, took his shovel from the cart, and began to walk towards where the wormcast had fallen. The others followed him as they walked, first across the spongy peatland, and then through the thick shit, which reached nearly to the tops of their boots by the time they were at the center of it. Once there, they clasped hands and then turned away from one another, walking towards the edge of the wormcast and drawing their shovels behind them to quarter it. Siffred brought his shovel, and they began to work, separating sticky spadefuls from the pat and ferrying it back to their carts. When they were both bringing loads to the cart, Siffred cleared his throat. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said. Errol grunted, levering the shovel high to drop the wormcast into the cart. "And now's the time, is it?" "Well, I guess it's as good a time as any, but I couldn't wait any longer. With the harvest coming, I mean." Errol planted the shovel on the ground and leaned his weight on it, catching his breath. "And so?" Well, I suppose you know that I've known Neve, I've known your daughter a long time, and, well, perhaps you know already. I hadn't thought a goldsmith's son was working as a seasoned man because he needed the coin," Errol said. Siffred was silent for a moment. "Yes, of course," he said, "and, well, the thing is, I'd like to marry her. I'd like to marry your daughter, to marry Neve." "Well," Errol said, "I suppose I should talk to Neve about this." "She feels the same as I do, sir." "I'm sure she does, but I'll talk to her just the same." Siffred laughed nervously. "Of course, I only meant—" Errol held up a hand. There was a sound he couldn't quite identify, something out of place. After a moment, he realized it was a voice, quietly chanting. 10 little men, all in a ring. 10 little men bowed to the king. He closed his eyes, turned his head slightly from side to side, still listening. 10 little men dance all day. 10 little men hide out. Errol reached out and seized the boy by his shirt collar. Of course it was Tyrrell, his son. His hand still splayed out in the dancing part of the charm. "What are you doing here?" Errol said. "Your sister's sure to be beside herself." "She didn't even look for me," Tyrrell said. He was a handsome boy, a bit small for 10, but already bearing the lean, serious face of a man. A thatch of chestnut hair, his mother's legacy, fell over his eyes. "I watched her before I followed you. She just went into the house." "And you showed her right," Errol said, frowning. "But I needed to come with you," Tyrrell said. "I have to start learning about things like this. I'll be a man soon enough, you know." Errol nodded slowly. "So you will," he said. "Well then, get in the cart and see if you can find any worm coal in this mess." Tyrrell wrinkled his nose in distaste. "What's worm coal?" Errol held his thumb and forefinger about an inch apart. "Shiny black balls, say this big. Burns purer than sea coal or charcoal. Might be we'll sell what we find to Siffred's father." "Is it just smiths that use it in their craftings? Or is it wizards too? We could give it to Uncle Allo." "Could be we would, if you find any. Now hop to." Tyrrell's eyes widened, and Errol turned to see what he was looking at. More dragons flying in from the east. Tyrrell began counting as they flew overhead. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a wedding. A moment later, another appeared on the horizon, and he laughed, a child again. "And 4 for a baby boy." Errol looked over at Siffred, who was blushing. He took a deep breath and went back to his work. By the time they had gone back to the farm, Neve had dinner ready. Errol kept his eyes on his plate as they ate the meal. Dark bread, meat pickle, and cheese. "Fetch me some rope and meet me on the afternoon porch," he said to Tyrrell as he stood. He turned to Siffred. The young man was a careful distance from Neve, keeping the fire pit between them. "There might be some trouble tonight. I need you to walk the fences today. Make sure they're all holding." Siffred nodded. "And me?" Neve asked. "Hex signs need freshening," Errol said. "You know where the paint is." He stepped out of the summer kitchen, then turned and went through the door that led into the storage room. He drew a rope-cutting knife from its drawer, then took 4 thunderstones from their box, and went through the long hall and out into the afternoon porch. Tyrrell was waiting for him there, sitting on a stool with a pile of rope at his feet. Errol settled into an empty stool across from him, put down the knife. "That was quite a charm you did this morning," he said. "Kept it up all the way to the marsh, and with 5 men out there, too. It's just a children's charm, Tyrrell said, but there was pride evident in his voice. He had always excelled at the craftings children did for mischief, making a leaf fly through the air or a thrown stick return to your hand. His hands were quick like his mother's had been, and he was able to hold his concentration much longer than any other boy his age. "Well, it's time you learned some proper crafts," Errol said. He gestured at the coil of rope. "We'll start with knots. Do you know any of those?" Tyrrell nodded. "Neve taught me the one to stop a nosebleed, with a red thread." "All right, let's see you do that one, but with a rope." Frowning, Tyrrell picked up the knife and cut off an arm's length of rope. He drew it into a loop, then crossed the standing part and brought it back up through the loop, drawing it tight. He regarded the knot for a moment and held it up to his father. "That's the knot your sister taught you?" Errol asked. Tyrrell nodded. "I think so. She only showed me once." "And does it work?" "Sometimes." "Maybe to stop a nosebleed, but it won't hold for much else. Untie that and let me show you a real knot." Tyrrell held the rope out to his father, but Errol shook his head. "No. I'll tell you what to do and you tie the knot. Hold up the rope and let one end drop. The part you're handing is the standing part. Between that and the end is the bite. Do you have that?" "Yes, father," Tyrrell said, rolling his eyes a little. Errol took a breath and went on. "Drop the end under the standing part and bring it back over. Now draw it back through the loop you've made." "That's the same knot I did," Tyrrell said. "It's not, and that's the difference between a knot that holds and one that betrays you. Now, make a loop enough to go over a cow or a horse's head. Mark the point where the loop closes. Then tie the knot I just showed you right there. Now make the loop again, so that it crosses just below the first knot, crosses under. Bring the end around and over the standing part. Now pass it under and up, through the loop." Tyrrell's hands moved hesitantly, finally pulling hard at the end. It slipped the length of the rope and does not vanish. "Why can't you just show me?" he asked. Errol shook his head. "You have to feel it in your hands." "Is that what makes a wizard?" Tyrrell asked, looking at his hands. "Did Uncle Owl have clever hands as a boy?" "Try that knot again," Errol said. He repeated his instructions, slowly, and this time Tyrrell's knot resolved into a figure 8. "Do you see? That knot brings the loop closed, but the first knot keeps it from closing too tight on the animal's neck." Tyrrell frowned. "That didn't feel like making a charm." "It wasn't. Not yet. The craft comes from doing it right, from tying it so well that your hands move the rope themselves and you just step out of the way." "What will it do if I do it right?" Errol reached out to touch the loop of rope his son had tied. "That's the lamb's knot. It'll keep an animal gentled, so long as it's around him." "Oh," Tyrrell said. "Well, what about the other knots? What do they do?" "There's no end to them," Errol said. "There's clever knots that will slip under a thief's fingers or bite like a snake, and wise knots that know the hand that touches them before they loosen or hold. But you be careful, and not just with knots. When you work a craft, it works you too." He looked Tyrrell in the eyes. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Tyrrell said. Errol held his son's gaze for a moment and then stood. "Here," he said, placing his hands flat against Tyrrell's elbows. "Push against my hands as hard as you can, as though you were trying to spread your wings like a bird." Tyrrell nodded and began to push. Errol had to work harder than he had expected to keep the boy's arms at his side, but after a few dozen heartbeats, Tyrrell gave up. "Now what?" he asked. Errol released the boy's arms, and they rose up of their own accord, as though he had been charmed. He looked from one arm to another in amazement. "Do you see now?" Errol asked. "Whatever you craft, you're always pushing against something, and it pushes you too." "I understand," Tyrrell said, in the deadly serious tone he used when he was trying to be grown up. He frowned. "If I learned what knots well enough, do you think I could do magic? Wizard magic?" "A wizard's just a crafter who doesn't make anything useful. Your mom could craft a candle that brought warmth to anyone in the home, a shoe that made a horse never stumble, and jam that let you remember the day the berries were picked. That's magic enough." Tyrrell said nothing. After a few moments he turned away, untied his knot, and began to tie it again, his brow furrowed. Errol watched him for a while and then stood. "When it feels like a craft, you'll know," he said. "When that happens, tie a half-dozen or so more. There's like to be some noise tonight, and I want the cattle to stay in their places." When he went to the barn, He could see the work Neve had done, repainting the hex signs. She had been doing them for years, since she had been about Tyrrell's age, and while he could still discern the shapes of his originals underneath, they were clearly her work, much more ornate, with his simple sunwheel shapes fractured and filigreed, and more colorful as well. He admired them for a moment, and then took his spade to the northeast corner of the barn. He dug a hole a hand deep, and then took from his pouch one of 4 thunderstones, flat stones shaped like axe heads, which had been left buried in the ground where lightning bolts had struck, and sang, "Roll, thunder, roll, down from mountains tall, where lightning touched once, let never lightning fall." With haying time so soon past, the barn might as well be a box of tinder, and he had seen enough to expect fire in the sky tonight. He went sunwise from corner to corner, burying a stone and singing the charm at each one. When he rounded the northwest corner, he saw Neve up on the ladder, freshening the paint on that side's hex signs. When she saw him, she stopped her work and came down the ladder. "Did Sifrid talk to you this morning?" she asked. Earl frowned. "Did you not ask him that?" She laughed. "I think you scared him, Father. I haven't seen even his shadow since dinner time." "Well, yes, he did talk to me." "And?" He took a slow breath. "And you already know what he said, so what questions could you have of me?" "Are you happy for me?" she asked, wrinkling her nose with exasperation. "Do you approve? Will you bless our wedding?" "This is not some fancy, then? You haven't just cooked up a love apple or twisted your belt to get him hot?" She crossed her arms. "Father, no. This is real. We both want this, and we..." He let her silence hang in the air. "Your ma'am could have taught you a crafting for that," he said quietly. "I haven't given you everything she would have, I know, but the wise woman owes me for winter corn. She could..." "It's what I want," Neve said. Earl nodded. "It's love, then, truly?" "I don't know," she said. "His father is the best goldsmith in Ravensthod. We could craft a charm that would make me the most beautiful woman there is." He smiled. "You are the most beautiful woman there is." She smiled too, sighing. "I know, Father, but really..." "And do either of you know any handfasts?" Neve shrugged. "Sifrid doesn't. I've tied a few with boys from the village, but, well, they were never meant to last." She looked away towards the farmhouse, then back to him. I was hoping you could teach us the handfast you and Mother tied." Earl said nothing, holding his hands in front of him. He curled his fingers, and then straightened them again slowly. "No," he said at last. "That's past me now, and besides, I needed your mom to tie that." "Of course," Neve said. He let his hands drop, put them on his hips. "There are plenty of fine handfasts I could teach you, ones that will last you a lifetime." He brushed his hands against the front of his pants. "I've got to finish burying these thunderstones and then get on my other work. I'll see you at supper." When he passed by the porch, he saw that Tyrrell was not there. There were about a dozen knotted harnesses lying abandoned on the ground, the first few tangled messes, the rest perfectly tied lamb's knots. He sighed and set out to find out how Sifrid was doing with the fence. He followed the fence's circuit until he heard voices ahead, one a young man's and one a child's, answering the question of where Tyrrell had gone. Earl looked at his hands and began to move them, stiffly at first, to do the charm his son had done that morning. He had not crafted it since he himself had been a boy, but he found his fingers remembered the motions, held up flat, then turned inwards, then coiled into a ring, bowing, dancing, tucked away into fists, as he quietly chanted the charm. 10 little men standing straight, 10 little men open the gate, 10 little men all in a ring, 10 little men bow to the king, 10 little men dance all day, 10 little men hide away. Earl could feel the craft working through him as he did the charm, and unlike his son, he did not need to repeat it to keep it going. Sifrid was leaning against the fence, his face covered with dust and his shirt damp with sweat. Tyrrell sat on the fence post, curled like a gargoyle as he interrogated the young man. "Will you and Neve live in Ravensthod?" Tyrrell was asking. "I expect we will, if we get married," Sifrid said. "Is it a big place? Are there wizards there? Did you ever see my uncle there?" Sifrid turned to look at the boy. "He passes through from time to time, and it's not as big a place as some, but it's bigger than others, bigger than your village." "Does it have a schoolhouse?" "Several." Tyrrell nodded sagely. "In the schoolhouses there, did they just teach you children's crafts, or did they teach you to be a wizard?" "I don't know," Sifrid said. He held his fingers splayed out in front of him. I was never in a schoolhouse. I was apprenticed as soon as I could hold a graver. Every time my hands grew, my father wept. But you don't need school to teach you crafting, or your uncle for that matter. I'm sure your father could teach you anything you might want to know. Father? Tyrrell asked. All he does is farm craftings. He won't even do knots, because of his fingers. Maybe now, but he did a great one once. He and your mother, that is. Didn't you ever notice how you're never short of water here? How spring comes a little sooner than in other farms? Summer stays a little later? Fruits ripen without rotting and keep without spoiling? Well, that's from the handfast they tied at their wedding. It bound them to each other in a way no handfast had ever done. Bound them to this farm and it to them. Bound even time itself. My father said it was the finest working he ever saw, as great as anything the Margrave or the thaumaturge ever did. Is that why you want to marry my sister? Tyrrell asked. To learn our magic? Siffred was silent for a moment. No, he said. I want to marry her because I love her. Tyrrell jumped down from the fence post. I think that would be a good reason to marry somebody, he said. A growing noise had been coming up the road, and now it resolved itself into the tread of dozens or hundreds of men, marching together in ragged rhythm. Soldiers, as many leaning on their spears as carrying them, and each with a hold coin sewn over his heart to protect him. Not the Margrave's things, Errol could see. These had to be the prince's men. Come back to the house, he called to Tyrrell and Siffred. I want to watch. Tyrrell, to the house, now. The boy threw him an angry look, and then began walking slowly towards the house. Errol kept his eyes on the prince's soldiers. They were not nearly so wild as the Margrave's beasts, but desperate men could do desperate things. Carton told me they're letting people shelter inside the walls of Ravenstad, Siffred said quietly. We could be there by nightfall if we rode. I'll tie the Holdfast, Errol said. We'll be safe. Yes, I know, Siffred said. I just thought we'll be safe. Without another word, they went back to the farmhouse. Errol and Neve brought the animals from the pasture back into the barn, dropping the tally sticks into the pail to keep from counting the cattle too closely. Then it was time for supper. Errol sat on a bench facing his daughter, eating his bread and soup in silence, while Tyrrell sat beside Siffred, peppering the young man with questions. They sat around the small fire for a while after supper while Neve did the dishes. Then it was time for Tyrrell to go to bed. Errol opened the bed closet and crouched to tuck his son into the quilts, reciting the night charm. Touch your collar, touch your toes, never catch a fever. Touch your knee, touch your chin, never let the burglar in. Tyrrell giggled when his father tapped his chin, then smiled sleepily. Do you think Uncle Owl will ever come to see us here, he asked. I don't know, Errol said. He's a busy man. Could we go visit him? It's not right, you know, that I've never seen my uncle, and I'm almost a man. Errol shook his head. I can't be traveling, you know that. I've the farm to care for, and in the winter the roads are no good. Took a breath. But you might, perhaps, now that you're almost a man. Or perhaps he'll come to Ravenstad to see your sister when she marries, and you can see him then. Yes, Tyrrell said, his eyes half shut. Yes, I think so. Errol crouched there for a few minutes more, listening to his son's breathing settle into the slow rhythm of sleep. Then he rose with some difficulty and went back out into the long hall. It was nearly dark, lit only by the embers of the small fire in the main room, and he did not know where Siffred and Neve had gone. Sighing, he went out the main door and up the path to the gate. He took the previous night's holdfast from where he had hung it on the fence post, untied it, and began work on the new one. None of the standard knots would be strong enough, not with what was likely to happen that night, but he might start with a sheep's tail knot for a base. Holding the end of the rope towards him, he made an overhand loop, then passed the end through it and up behind the standing part. He passed the end down through the loop a second time, and then continued to elaborate the knot, feeling his fingers soften like butter as the craft began to work through him. Soon he had a knot that would hold against the Margrave and the thaumaturge both, but he did not stop. As the rope danced in his hands, twisting around and around himself and slipping over and under the loops he had made, he knew that if he wanted to, he could tie a knot that would be greater even than the handfast he and Elise had made, a knot that would hold everything just as it was, bind them all, and hold fast against time and chance. He held the end of the rope in his hand, took a breath. The night passed, as all nights eventually do, but it never grew very dark, with spells, lightning, and dragonfire lighting the sky. Unable to sleep, Errol went to the summer kitchen kicked at the coals in the fire pit until he exposed a glowing ember and lit a candle from it. Then he went to the storage room and hauled up the trapdoor to the cellar before going carefully down the stairs. In the dim light of the candle, it took him a while to find what he was looking for. A few jars of blackberry jam, hidden away in memory of the day he and Neve had gone foraging in the bush, and Elise had preserved the few berries they had brought home. He went back upstairs and sat on the bench by the cold ashes of the fire, licking the dark jam from his fingers. When true dawn finally came, he went outside and surveyed the barn. Surveyed the farm. The barn was entirely intact, even the hex signs unmarked, and the stable door still held. He walked down the path to the gate and kneeled down to untie the holdfast, feeling the craft dissipate as he loosened the knot. "Morning find you!" Allred was coming down the road towards him, the front of his hat pulled down low to block out the morning sun. "And you?" Allred stood on the other side of the gate, his hands on his hips. "Did you hear? The prince's men prevailed, if you can believe it. Why, they say the thaumaturge himself took part in the battle." He tilted his hat upwards as a grin crossed his face. "The Margrave is overthrown." Errol undid the last loop and hung the now slack rope on the fence post. He stood up and nodded slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees. "Well, there's that."